Hello, my name is Miranda, and today I will be talking about the composer Franz Schubert. Some of the things we'll be talking about is his early life, his education and tutoring, as well as some occupations, a timeline of important events that transpired throughout his life, as well as some hardships and his overall fame. Franz Schubert was an Austrian composer. He was born on January 31st, 1797, in Himmeltvergrund, Austria, which is a small town outside of Vienna, Austria, and he died November 19th, 1828, making him 31 years old. Franz Schubert came from a relatively large family. He had three brothers and one sister. His father was a school teacher, and his mother was a housewife. As a young child, he showed interest in music, so his older brother Ignaz and his father mentored him in classical music, teaching him how to play instruments and compose music, and they both saw a musical talent within him. The family cultivated a string quartet, and Schubert played the viola. Schubert was very shy and did not stand out very much. His peers would describe him as quite eccentric and a little bit of a loner, maybe a little bit insecure. Uh, Beethoven actually lived within the town that Franz Schubert lived in, and even in passing by on the street and recognizing Beethoven, Schubert never introduced himself. Schubert was heavily influenced by Romantic poets at the time, such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Uh, the beginning of the Romance musical era was very heavily influenced by Romantic poets, and this was right at the end of the classical music era. Around 11 to 12 years old, Schubert showed exceptional music skill and earned a scholarship to Stettkonvikt, a boarding school that mentored students in singing, and that would also reserve him a spot in the court chapel choir, which was quite an honor. While there, he was actually mentored by Antonio Salieri, a famous composer at the time who spoke very highly of Schubert. Schubert eventually left the school a few years later due to his voice breaking, and during the next few years, he wrote many songs and music relentlessly, but always felt pressure from his parents to find a real job. So, around the age of 18, he became a school teacher like his father, only to eventually quit that a few years later to focus on his music composition. Schubert had very little luck during these years to get a big break. He had many friends that promoted his music to poets and other playwriters, and some of them worked out, but he never really got the recognition he was looking for. Antonio Salieri continued mentoring him for years after he left Stettkonvikt, and Schubert's music became popular among the rich for dance parties and balls. Franz Schubert was said to be one of the last classical composers and one of the first Romantic composers. Later composers would describe him as the most poetic composer due to his heavy influence from Romantic poems and the darkness or sorrow moods felt in his music. Schubert was also known for his mastery of the Lied. The Lied are songs that are very piano heavy and were mostly written for Romantic poetry pieces. These were songs that typically had intimate moods and were suggested to be listened to within the home rather than a large concert. His most famous Lied, and one of the most famous Lieds in general, is the Erkling, a poem written by Johann Goethe that Schubert composed the music for. After his death, he had major influence on Romantic composers such as Johannes Brahms, Robert Schumann, and Hugo Wolf. Some of his most famous works were the Erkling, Ave Maria, Symphony Number 9 in C minor, which is also known as the Great Symphony, and the Unfinished Symphony, which is one of my favorites that actually led to my interest in researching Schubert. Most of Schubert's living career as a composer was unfruitful. He never found the recognition he sought after, and a lot of this was due to his music not being traditional classical music. He can be considered ahead of his time due to his music leaning heavily toward the Romantic music genre, which unfortunately didn't blossom fully until after Schubert's death. Beethoven was also very popular during this time, so for someone like Schubert who was shying away from traditional music, it was incredibly difficult for him to stand out. He also suffered from depression and was a very timid person, making it even more difficult to get his name out to a larger crowd. Schubert could not help but feel like a failure due to his career never taking off in upwards of 10 to 15 years. To make matters worse, in the early 1820s, Schubert contracted a disease that would cause the last years of his life to be very difficult physically. All of these factors can obviously attribute to his depression and further isolation. Even so, the 1820s were his most productive years, creating works like Alfonso and Estrella, which was a three-act opera, or Ave Maria, the Great Symphony, and the Unfinished Symphony. Schubert showed unrelenting determination even after his failure and his illness, and he never gave up. He continued writing music up until the day he died. This is a remarkable characteristic about him and shows his deep love for music composition. His story is like many others in that he did not gain the recognition he deserved until well after his death, allegedly when the Romantic era began. Composers around that time referred back to his music and called him a musical genius, and some of his pieces finally came to public concert. In fact, while he was alive, his one and only public concert took place in March of 1828, the year of his death. The show proved successful enough that Schubert was finally able to purchase his own piano.